What if I told you that these two are siblings? Maybe cousins? Or distant relatives by marriage? Both their manufacturers actually share a parent company, Geely, and they're built on the same platform. But these two SUVs are by no means the same. The Volvo EX30 and the Smart #1 both want to be the small electric SUV for you, but these two variants in particular want to go about it really quickly because both of them can hit 100Ks in less than 4 seconds. Now have I got your attention? In one corner, we have the Volvo EX30 Twin Motor Performance Ultra, and in the other, the Smart #1 Brabus. Both of these are built on the same Geely platform that also underpins the Zeekr X, and both of them have the same powerful dual-motor all-wheel drive setup, same outputs and everything. And both of them could probably do with a name change for different reasons. But where do they start to diverge? Because both of these cars land just either side of 70 grand, and both of them are pretty packed with features.
Both cars come with the sort of premium kit you'd expect for something of this size at this price. Heated front seats, a sunroof, wireless phone charging, premium sound systems, big multimedia touchscreens, keyless entry and start, and electric tailgates. But when it comes to the specifics of each, one seems to come out just a little ahead in terms of the goods. And it's not the more expensive one. Yep, the Volvo misses out on a couple of little things that make the Smart work better as an everyday car. For example, the Smart has a sunroof blind to stop the sun turning it into an oven, but Volvo charges extra for a clip-in unit. The Smart also has a head-up display for the driver, but the Volvo has the Harman Kardon soundbar in the way. Another little thoughtful addition for the #1 is the central storage bin in the Smart is actually cooled via the air conditioning, though the EX30 does have retractable cup holders. The full written review at carsguide.com.au has the full list of goodies for each car.
Of course, the biggest difference between these two cars is visual. And while both are looking to convey a vibe to their intended buyer, both those vibes are kind of different, and whether either work is up for debate. I'll start with the EX30, which I think looks pretty good for the most part. Of course, it's a little conservative when it comes down to it in some of its details, but some design elements like the Volvo logo in the middle of the grille with that diagonal bar and the Thor's hammer headlights either already were or have become staples in Volvo's design language. I also enjoy that it doesn't look like it was designed exclusively in a wind tunnel. It's still a little bit boxy, as Volvo's kind of should be. Volvo has also not been one for bright colours traditionally, but one of the options on the EX30, Moss Yellow, is a little bit more bright than this cloud blue here on our test car. Inside, our test car has one of 4 options. This one is called Indigo, and that means it has denim trim on the seats. Although all the options when it comes to things like materials and trim, even through the other 3 options, all seem pretty premium to me. Unfortunately, even if you like the Scandinavian minimalism design though, you might be surprised to see just how far it's gone in the EX30 because anything that could be described as a button has been given the Scandi flick. When it comes to the space, it feels nice and airy, and sure, that's great, but this trend of having everything go through one single multimedia screen in the center of the car can honestly get in the bin. On top of that, to get the most out of the native multimedia here in the EX30, you need to log in with your Google account, which I'm sure will turn some off right away anyway. Once it's all set up, it is a lot easier to use, but it takes a little bit of getting used to, and getting used to something isn't really what you want to do when it comes to your car. On top of that, it's a real shame that there's no heads-up display or driver display directly in front of you. And while the Harman Kardon soundbar across the front of the car does look nice and futuristic, it is sort of a little bit unnatural in the way it sounds, and it doesn't really justify its existence there. As is becoming more the trend now, here we are having to turn our head to the center of the car to even check things like the speed, but also to adjust any settings. And that includes things like the steering wheel position and the mirrors on the sides of the car as well. You have to go into the menu, find the settings for them, and then use the buttons on the steering wheel to do it. The thought behind this, apparently from Volvo, is that you only really ever need to set that sort of stuff up occasionally. But to me, it sounds a little bit more like cost cutting. Speaking of cost cutting, there's actually no cover for the sunroof here by default. You can buy one as an accessory to clip into place, but there's no little panel to open and close the roof like you would get in other cars and like you get in the Smart. And as it's summer right now, I can confirm that it does get extremely hot in this car. The steering wheel the other day was actually a little bit hard to touch. It's not all bad news in here though, because there are some clever things that have been done with the space. For example, to keep this space here with this storage area down there all sort of clear, The cup holders can actually be moved in and out of the way, and even the cup holders themselves, that top bit can slide out of the way, so it just becomes another nice little storage bin there. The wireless charger for devices and phones down here is just out of reach, but still visible, which is kind of nice. It's less of a distraction there, plus it sort of slots into place and doesn't slide around. The door bin also, while it can fit a full-sized water bottle, doesn't really have anything to stop it from sliding around or rolling over in there. That airy, spacious feeling up the front, unfortunately, comes at a cost, and that cost is here in the second row. Despite the fact that there's this sunroof to make things feel a little bit more open, there's actually not a lot of space in here. My knees are, for example, almost touching the seat in front of me, and my feet, if I don't want to bend my knees too much, are tucked in under the seat as well, and my toes are kind of squished a little bit. This is my own seating position. I'm about 180 centimeters, so pretty average, and the fact that I can't really fit in here behind myself is a little bit concerning. The seat behind me is a little bit maybe too upright. I'm not sure if it's the lumbar support that's trying to do something good for my back here, but it doesn't feel super comfortable, and anything longer than a short trip, I'd start probably getting a bit irate. There's also no armrest here in the middle. There's no vents for the rear passengers to control or use at all. There are the window buttons here and a couple of USB-C ports though for devices. And there's a small little storage bin here under the armrest as well. The EX30's 318-litre boot isn't exactly cavernous for a small SUV, but given it's an electric car, you've got to remember there's some battery taking up a little bit of that space. There is also a drop-down area under there for the charging cables, as well as anything that you don't want to get on the visible carpet up here. There is also, as you might have expected, no spare tyre. There is a repair kit, as is becoming the norm a little bit these days, kind of unfortunately. And it is the same for that thing over there as well. When I was a kid, I always thought the Smart 4.2 looked a little bit goofy. And now here I am kind of with some familiar feelings about the hashtag one. It's a little bit longer and a little bit taller than the Volvo EX30, but I think it looks just a little bit out of proportion, like someone's kind of stretched it in Photoshop a little bit. It probably doesn't help that this black and red car we've got here on test looks a little bit like someone took a mini JCW and bought it off a dodgy website. Even its key fob is circular, which is another modern mini thing. But Mercedes-Benz had a hand in designing the hashtag one, and I reckon there are design elements that work well in isolation. For example, the taillight cluster at the back of the car definitely has some EQA vibes to it. And even though that red roof melts down the back of the car a little bit, the colour schemes available on this car are kind of a little bit more fun than you might expect from the German manufacturer. In the cabin, it gets even more Mercedes. For a start, there's these rounded air vents, plus the big screen here mounted above these two closable compartments here. It's all a bit Stuttgart. And there's a lot of red in the cabin here in this Brabus variant as well, although I reckon the red in the headrest here might be a little bit too much. But when it comes to practicality, the interior here in the Smart beats the EX30. For a start, there's buttons, like actual physical buttons, and there's a little quick menu down the bottom of the touchscreen here as well. On top of that, I do also have another screen in front of me. There's a proper driver display, and above that, a heads-up display as well. So I do have directly in front of me all the information I need. In fact, the heads-up display is actually really well thought out in the way it displays information. It's a little bit subtle. It gives you like a little bit of a warning for the blind spot rather than trying to make it sound like you've done something wrong. Unfortunately, the touchscreen here isn't super intuitive at first, even though there is a relatively quick way to get to most of the menus. It just looks a little bit odd. In fact, I would say the graphics on there are probably a little bit childish and goofy. There's a little AI Fox cartoon assistant thing that's supposed to help you out, but it just has kind of the same grating voice most AI assistants do. Plus, there's this planet Earth sort of motif going on with all the drive modes that I'm not really sure why it's there. Physically though, the space in the hashtag one is pretty nice. It's not quite as airy as the Volvo, but there's plenty of storage. You can fit a proper sized water bottle in the door bin, for example. The little phone charger here is able to be put nicely out of the way. The cup holders here and another little slot for smaller items. Plus there's actually an air vent in the little bin here, which you can adjust how strong the flow is. So that's pretty helpful if you want to keep things like drinks cool. In the second row of the Smart, it feels a little bit more airy than it does in the EX30, and that's probably got something to do with that extra wheelbase and the height. There's no risk of my head touching the roof here, although I'm not particularly tall, about 180 centimeters. My feet do kind of slip under the driver's seat in front of me a little bit. There's not heaps of toe room, but there's enough. And Honestly, even here behind my own seating position, my legs feel fine. You've got armrests either side of you, plus this seat is actually adjustable. You can lean it forward a little bit if you want. On top of that, there's also air vents adjustable for each passenger side, plus a USB-A and USB-C port as well. The Smart's 323 litre boot has the Volvo beat by about 5 litres, but it's the same situation with this lift-up floor here, a big cavernous area under there, tyre repair kit, a first aid kit as well, but no charger by default.
Both of these cars have the same drivetrains, a dual motor setup creating an all-wheel drive system, and both offering 315 kilowatts and 543 newton meters. The difference is how they deliver that power, and this means the Volvo has a claimed 0 to 100 time of 3.6 seconds, the Smart 3.9. The Volvo's drivetrain can be set to prioritize performance or range via 2 settings, but the hashtag one has 4 drive modes, from Eco, Comfort, Sport, up to Brabus. Both cars should theoretically be able to achieve similar efficiency given the shared drivetrains and similar batteries and weights. The Volvo's got a 69 kilowatt hour battery and a 445 kilometer range according to the brand, while the Smart has a 66 kilowatt hour battery and a 400 kilometer range. Given the shared platform, it's possible both are physically the same and just measured differently. Putting these to the test over a long drive loop involving highways, winding fast roads, and some suburbia, both cars started the trip at about 70% battery and finished at around 20%. So under hard driving, both burn through about the same amount of power. They also charge at about the same rate, just under half an hour to go from 10 to 80% each, though we saw the Volvo charge at a peak of 134 kilowatts, well under its 175 max, while the Smart peaked at 157 kilowatts, which is 7 kilowatts over its claimed 150 max. A little bit odd. The trip computers for each were slightly more telling. The longest stretch of measurement under our watch in the Smart was a few days, and the car told us it was averaging 19.4 kilowatt hours per 100 Ks. The EX30, however, has been under the custodianship of CarsGuide's head of editorial, Justin Hilliard, for a few months, and during the month it went up against the Smart, it returned an 18.3 kilowatt hour figure. I'd say both are day-to-day about as efficient as each other, but the real-world range you're likely to get out of them is more like 340 to 370 kilometers, depending on use.
Both cars being built on the same platform and with the same powertrain doesn't necessarily mean they're going to drive exactly the same, of course. Once the manufacturers got a hold of the platform and started building their own car on top of it, some differences have come out. And the Smart #1, for example, seems like it's a little bit more fun and maybe just a tiny bit sharper than the EX30. It's got a longer wheelbase, and even though it's a little bit taller and narrower, it seems a little bit more planted down. The way it delivers its power too, through its 4 drive modes, which go all the way from Eco to the top Brabus mode, is a little bit more eager when you've got it in that top mode. It's very aggressive and it really pins you to the back of your seat, whereas even in the more powerful version of the EX30's drive modes, it doesn't quite have that same aggression, but we'll get to that. What I will say about the Brabus is it feels a lot more composed and maybe even a little bit more like a serious fast car than it looks. Of the two, it is the one with the slower 0 to 100 claim, but it doesn't really feel like that. In fact, its suspension feels a little bit stiffer and there's a little bit more visceral noise, not just because of the tires and the wind noise, but also because you've got some options with this where you can sort of play with the fake sounds that come through the speakers. I've turned them off because I don't particularly like them, but they're kind of fun and they're there if you feel like something a bit gimmicky. But because of its immediate power and torque delivery, one thing that I can say about this car on a little twisty road is that it feels, to sort of use a fake word, chuckable. It really is a car that you can just kind of point and click your foot down on the accelerator with. As much as it's egging you on for a fun time, it still doesn't quite let itself get too out of control. And its all-wheel drive setup probably helps a little bit there, but at the same time it just feels like it's quite a composed chassis and its motors do a pretty good job of keeping everything sort of just at the limit of where they should be. Where it probably does fall a little bit short in the sports car department is some of the feeling. So, for example, the steering has a couple of settings, but I think it's best just left probably in its medium mode because light feels like you're sort of about to turn it into a car park and heavy just has some extra weight for no reason. I mentioned the suspension being a little bit stiff, but it's actually pretty comfortable for a car with sort of sporty tuned suspension. It doesn't let sharp bumps crash through the cabin and it doesn't waft too much over sort of undulating surfaces. Overall, it strikes a pretty good balance between a fun driving car, but also one that you could probably live with day to day. And even though it looks probably a little bit boy racer, there is sort of a kind of more mature side to the Smart #1 Brabus. On the road though, where it does fall down a little bit is the way some of its safety systems operate. They're a little bit intrusive compared to the Volvos, and things like its traffic sensing doesn't feel particularly intuitive. It feels like you kind of have to be constantly monitoring what it's doing just in case it decides to sit too close to another car or slow down too much and, surprise the car behind you. You can minimize the driver assistance so that, the cruise control is just that rather than sort of an advanced driver assistance, but it's a bit of a shame that this car, being so similar to the Volvo, falls short in something where the other one kind of excels. But despite its safety systems falling just a little bit short, this car is a lot easier to get used to quickly, and having things like all of the information directly in front of you does make it an awful lot easier to start driving it straight away rather than having to mess around with a big central screen. The first thing I noticed straight away driving these cars back to back was how much softer the brake pedal feels in the Volvo. It's almost a little bit spongy compared to that of the Smart. But it's not the only thing about the Volvo that's softer. Its suspension feels a little bit more compliant, but also not quite as dialed in. Its steering doesn't have as much feel, or at least as much weight. And just generally the car feels a little bit smoother, maybe a little bit less eager to have fun like the Smart does. Overall, it feels like a much more mature car, but maybe one that's less willing to be thrown into a corner and rocket straight back out of it again on the other side. But that's not a bad thing. I think the Volvo does a lot of things better. It's a lot less noisy from the outside. For example, it doesn't have the same road noise and wind noise that the Smart does. Plus, it's still pretty comfortable to be in, and the visibility for a car with quite thick C-pillars isn't too bad. It's actually quite an easy car to use once you get past this whole center screen thing and the fact that there's no information directly in front of you. Plus, even though it's not quite as aggressive with the acceleration, it still will do 0 to 100 0.3 of a second faster than the Smart, on paper at least. So while it doesn't have the flashes of red on the outside or the extremely aggressive acceleration, the Volvo EX30 does actually, on paper at least, feel like it might be the quiet achiever. It also has the longer driving range of the two. When I say soft though, that doesn't necessarily mean I think the EX30 is a performance slouch. Its body roll and its pitching and stuff like that is probably on par with the Smart in my view. I think both of them handle themselves really well, and even though it doesn't feel as eager to be thrown around on a tight twisty road, the EX30 will absolutely hold its own. It just might not feel quite as engaging. There are a couple of things about the way the EX30 drives that I find a little bit odd. For example, having to go through, I think 3 or 4 different submenus, it feels like, to get to the part where you actually change the way it delivers its acceleration, whether it focuses more on range or more on performance. The other thing is that its one pedal driving doesn't feel very one pedal. Even if you're driving at a normal sort of traffic speed and you let off the accelerator, it doesn't quite bring you to a stop. Maybe as quickly as you would expect it to, which I think means you probably shouldn't be calling it one pedal driving. The other thing, and maybe it's the fact that it feels more spacious inside and it's messing with my brain a little bit, but it feels maybe like it's a little bit bigger than the Smart #1, even though I know on paper it isn't. It's got a shorter wheelbase and it's a little bit shorter actually in height as well. But on the road, there is one area the EX30 excels over the Smart, and that's when it comes to the way its safety systems are sorted. It kind of just does everything as you would hope or expect it to do. Things like its cruise control and its advanced driver assistance set everything to sort of the position you'd want them to be. If you say you want to be, at a comfortable but close space to the car in front of you on the highway, it's not going to have you right up behind it, but it's also not going to be, adjusting the speed constantly and slowing down and speeding up in a way that feels inconsistent. It also centers you in that lane nicely, and it doesn't come up with little warnings and dings and things that you sort of don't expect without any explanation. On top of that, it is relatively easy to adjust whether you've got it set to a full, driving assistant or just cruise control. There's the little gear selector if you nudge it down into drive, or there's buttons sort of on the steering wheel as well for that too. But again, even when it comes to that safety stuff, the downside is obviously the part where you have to go through the screen to turn on and off and adjust the way some of that stuff works. And it means looking away from the road for quite a while. But while they've got their strengths and weaknesses, neither of these cars really fall down when it comes to the on-road stuff. And both of them have a lot to offer when you're behind the wheel. It's a tick for both of them when it comes to that regard.
Both cars have a 5-star safety rating under ANCAP's testing, though it's the Smart that has better occupant protection for both adults and children. In fact, its adult protection score is an excellent 96%. They're also both chockers with safety kit, things like semi-autonomous cruise control, parking assist, driver alerts and AEB, and both even have 7 airbags. But the biggest difference is in how the active safety systems operate in each. For full details on the safety features in each car, go to the full review at carsguide.com.au. When it comes to ownership after you've bought one, picking up an EX30 means 5 years of unlimited kilometre warranty and roadside assist, with the battery covered for 8 years. That's about average for a Euro brand, but 5 years or 150,000 kilometres of free servicing, whichever comes first, is excellent. Intervals are every 24 months or 30,000 kilometres. The Smart #1 falls a little behind here, with a 5-year or 150,000 kilometre warranty, which is okay but not great. Plus, the 8-year coverage for the battery is limited by the same distance, 150,000 Ks. Smart's servicing intervals are also a little short, at every 12 months or every 20,000 Ks. And even though the brand doesn't publish its servicing costs online, we were told by them that it costs $2,231 over the course of a 5-year plan, which seems a little bit expensive given the lack of moving parts in an EV.
What both of these brands have managed to build on this platform is truly impressive, especially when you put it into the perspective that you can get essentially a supercar chasing small electric SUV for around $70,000. Both of these cars are great and there's not really a bad decision here, but when it comes down to the pluses and minuses of each, I would probably say that the Smart is a little bit of a short-term offering while the Volvo has more long-term benefits. It's got a steeper learning curve, but I reckon it's probably the one I would choose if I had to actually live with it for a long time. But if you made me pick one car I could take for a drive right now, I think it would still be the #1. Of course, the full review with more details is at carsguide.com.au, but hopefully after having seen the strengths and weaknesses of these two cars, you can make up your own mind about which one might suit you better.